embarking on a discussion of Psalm 119. Of course, the first and most obvious observation to make in encountering the Psalm is, goodness, how enormous it is. It is, without any even remote competition, the longest chapter in the entire Bible. Now, of course, as many of you have heard me comment over the years, we don't get so excited about chapters in most of the Bible. You know why? That is, it's not really an ancestral division of the Bible, except in two books where it is: the Psalms and Lamentations, in both of which the division is indeed the original division, the individual Psalms and the individual Lamentations. And at least one aspect, which is particularly glaring in Lamentations chapters 1 through 4, and also in many Psalms, including this one, is the issue of an acrostic, which of course can't possibly be preserved in translation. But of course, as you know, the alphabet, I mean the original alphabet, which is the Aleph Bet, has 22 letters. And in an acrostic, the successive verses begin with the successive letters of the Aleph Bet. There are a couple in particular, there are a couple in the Psalms in which one letter may be missing. There's always an interesting reason to explore for why that is the case. In Lamentations, there's also the issue of the inversion of two letters. We won't get into that, of course. But we do appreciate that the format of an acrostic is indeed a significant one in the Hebrew Bible. And perhaps right off the bat, we should be considering why indeed the acrostic format is something significant. I'll just note as a particular example in our tradition. As you may be aware, Psalm 145, which is an acrostic, takes a very central place in Jewish liturgy. We recite Psalm 145 at least 3 times daily, twice in the morning service, once in the afternoon service. And in exploring the question in our sources as to why Psalm 145 is so central, one of the dimensions, obviously it can't be the only dimension because Psalm 145 isn't the only example of it, is the fact that it's an acrostic. And what significance is there in this acrostic format? On some level, we regard the letters of the Aleph Bet as not merely being technicalities, but rather conduits through which, as it were, God's wisdom flows into the world. So there's a dimension with respect to the acrostic that resonates with human wisdom as ultimately being the vessel that receives from God. And simultaneously, that implies that those passages in the Bible that are ordered as acrostics are on some level supposed to be particularly instructive. And of course, to that extent, we can readily appreciate that Psalm 119 is definitely intended to be instructive. But of course, there's the additional dimension, and this additional dimension sets Psalm 119 apart from every other acrostic in the Bible. It's not just an acrostic, it's an octuple acrostic. The closest competition is Lamentations chapter 3, which is a triple acrostic. But Psalm 119 is an octuple acrostic, which of course is responsible for its 176 verses, 22 times 8. And what's the significance of it being an octuple acrostic? So in this regard, regarding the significance of numbers, we turn to a significant figure in Jewish scholarship from the late medieval, early Renaissance period, Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague. He lived from approximately 1512, the year of birth is not entirely clear, till 1609. And besides being one of the great scholars of Judaica and philosophers of Judaism in the period, he was also actually a mathematician. He had a close friendship with Tycho Brahe, an interesting biography. But perhaps as a result, he, more than anyone else before him, developed the theory of the significance of numbers in the Bible. And while, of course, we're not going to expand on that to excess because we have much more of an agenda ahead of us, I think it behooves us to consider the significance of the number 8 here. In particular, to consider the significance of the number 8 as he presents it in the wake of numbers 6 and 7. The significance of the number 6, the number of cardinal directions. 4 directions in a plane, up and down. So on some level, our mundane world is subsumed within the number 6. There are also 6 days of the work week, besides the Sabbath. And this, of course, inevitably brings us to considering the significance of the number 7. 7 is vesting the sixfold reality of this mundane world with meaning. So first, spatially, there are 6 cardinal directions, but you aren't anchored in space if you don't have, in addition to the 6 cardinal directions, also a point of origin. That's the 7th. And in the realm of time, of course, self-evidently, you have the 6 days of the work week and you have the Sabbath. And those 6 days of the work week are necessarily anchored in their relationship to the Sabbath, which in our tradition is simultaneously the fruit of the week and its seed, which of course is not just a mixed metaphor. It seems like 2 contradictory motifs. The fruit is the culmination, the seed is the point of germination. But of course the Sabbath is both. It's the fruit of the week that precedes it. It's the seed, the germination point for the week that follows. So again, it's the anchoring of the 6 in the 7th. And in that vein, we can describe the significance of the number 7, again, both spatially and temporally, as investing the realm of the mundane with meaning, with significance, in some sense then the spirituality that inheres in the realm of the physical. And that serves inevitably as the prelude to number 8. The number 8 is all about transcendence. It is specifically 7 plus 1, taking us into the realm of the beyond the 7. And while we can seek to illustrate this on manifold planes, perhaps the most obvious being in 2 dimensions of the cycle of the holy days, that you have the 7 days of Sukkot, of tabernacles, surmounted by 7 plus 1, which is the holy convocation that has in the last 2 millennia also become associated with the celebration of the Torah. I'm going to get back to that in a moment. And manifestly, of course, the celebration of the theophany at Sinai, the giving of the Torah, Pentecost, which is not 7 plus 1, but 7 times 7 plus 1, the 50th day. And again, that essentially amounts to the same idea. And you'll note that in both of these illustrations, there is an inextricable link to specifically the Torah. That is, the rejoicing of the Torah is on the 7 plus 1th day of Tabernacles. The celebration, the commemoration of the traditional date of the Theophany at Sinai, the giving of the Torah, is likewise 7 times 7 plus 1. With respect to the Passover, the physical liberation culminating in the spiritual liberation of receiving the Torah, again, the commemoration of ultimate transcendence. And that brings us to the book of Psalms, but not just Psalm 119. Rabbi Judah Lowy, indeed, notes the octuple acrostic of Psalm 119, and he interprets it as an inevitable reflection of the fact that Psalm 119 is all about the Torah. But he also stresses the point with respect to Psalm 19. Now, Psalm 19 is not an acrostic. It certainly isn't 176 verses long. But what is so glaring and significant for us with respect to Psalm 19 is, how does it begin? It begins with the description of seeking God in nature, if you will, spirituality in the realm of the mundane. A song to the choir master, a psalm of David. The heavens recount the glory of God, and the firmament tells the work of his hands. Day to day utters speech, and night to night speaks knowledge. There need be no speech nor words. Their voice is heard without it. Their measuring line goes forth from them all over the earth. But where the world of man ends, their words speak. He has set a tent in them for the orb of the sun. And then reflecting upon the sun, which is, from our terrestrial perspective, the focal point of the natural world and its culmination. As a bridegroom, it steps forth from its chamber. It rejoices as if it had sole power to run its course, and yet one point upon the heavens remains its origin, and its orbit is within their defined bounds, and thus he is not hidden even before his sun. All of this, again, is reflecting upon the natural world. And how many verses have we considered heretofore in Psalm 19? 7. And the 8th verse, the Torah of the Lord is perfect, all-encompassing. In other words, again, that Torah is the 8th that transcends the 7. So the significance then of specifically the octuple acrostic, and altogether the significance of the number 8, which of course becomes so manifestly obvious in Psalm 119, is something that we inextricably link to the association with the Torah and the role of the Torah as signifying transcendence.
Rabbi, just one clarification. You mentioned the 8th verse of Psalm 19. Are you then, this is in keeping with the Jewish tradition that the first verse is actually the header, correct?
Correct. But of course, in the Masoretic text, it has to be, because after all, the division of the text into verses is dictated by the tropes, by the cantillation points. So yes, so that header is indeed verse number 1, unequivocally. So that means that the 8th verse is the Torah of God is perfect.
And is that the case in Psalm 119?
You have a header in Psalm 119?
I don't know. I don't remember.
I don't think for us, there's certainly there isn't any concept of a header that isn't included in the verses of the text. But I would imagine that in any Bible, there isn't any header in Psalm 119 because it's launching right into it. It's not there isn't that any instruction for the choir master or anything of the sort. I guess. I mean, I don't know. I'm just using the Hebrew Bible. You'll have to give me the contrast note. But I assume we also see you have 176 verses in Psalm 119. Then we're on the same page. Okay, 8 times 22.
You can hear Rabbi Chaim Eisen live in Texas on February 11th at the Georgetown Public Library. He will be speaking at 7:30 p.m. He will also be speaking in Houston, McKinney, Melissa, and Granbury, Texas in the following days. To get detailed address and times for those other speaking events, just contact Rabbi Eisen directly using WhatsApp with his WhatsApp number listed below. He will be most happy to speak with you and give you those additional details. He would look forward to meeting you, and we hope to see you at one of these new events.
But again, so to that extent, of course, it's important for us to consider then what this signifies with respect to our attitude vis-a-vis Torah, before we consider the various, I'll describe them as pseudo-synonyms for Torah. I'll justify my fabricating that word in a moment. But before we do that, just to appreciate the undergirding altogether in speaking about Torah. And in this regard, it behooves me to stress the point that while on the one hand, we of course readily appreciate that the Torah serves as, if you will, a user's manual for how to live in this world. And inevitably, in that vein, any user's manual is predicated upon the preexistence of that which you're going to use. Simultaneously, you also relate to Torah on an additional plane as the blueprint of the universe. Now, manifestly, the Torah, as we read it, presumes a universe. It doesn't read as a blueprint. But we have what we might describe as an esoteric tradition, that the Torah, as we read it, is, if you will, the terrestrial counterpart of a transcendent Torah that, as it were, predates creation. Of course, inevitably I had to say predates with quotation marks because God created time and creation, so predates in any literal sense is a meaningless term if time didn't exist. But that Torah on that transcendent plane is, if you will, more primordial, hierarchically superior to the very universe itself. And just what does that invoke conceptually? Obviously, that's a level that definitionally eludes human grasp. But the underlying premise is that the foundation of the physical world is in the spiritual and not the other way around. Of course, the Torah, as we read it, is a user's manual, and as any user's manual, it's predicated upon an undergirding of the universe. But the underlying premise that there is something still more essential than the universe itself, and that everything that exists in the physical universe is not and cannot be self-justifying, because ultimately it exists as the actualization of a spiritual undergirding that is, as it were, planted by God before creation itself. Again, before, in quotes. It's a fundamental premise in the way we relate to the universe itself. That spirituality is not some kind of overlay. It's not something that comes afterward and is superimposed upon an existent universe. It is something inherent in the very fabric of the universe. And indeed, it's even more fundamental than the universe as we observe it. And to that extent, then, when we speak of Torah, we're also invoking that. So, the way I always like to express this as an admittedly simple-minded analogy, just to get the point across, is consider when you go to the dealership and pick up your new car. And of course, together with the car, you get the user's manual. Well, that is one piece of literature associated with the car. There's another piece of literature associated with the car that you don't get: the blueprints of the car. The most obvious difference between the two is, well, the user's manual should be something that you can comprehend without being an automotive engineer. The blueprint, certainly not. And yet simultaneously, if you think about it, on the most pedestrian plane, if the user's manual tells you that there's a certain button on the dashboard that will accomplish something, it will only accomplish that because in the counterpart of the user's manual, in the blueprint, that button was wired to accomplish what the user's manual says it's going to do. So on some level, the blueprint and the user's manual are reflections of the same underlying essential reality. And so on some level, they are both one and the same, but we can only read Torah on the level of the user's manual. There is indeed an esoteric tradition that the very words of the Torah can be parsed in a different manner than the way we do to read the user's manual, and that would signify transcendent names of God. And indeed, the tradition that the Torah, that, as it were, predates creation, is a Torah not of black ink on white parchment, but black fire on white fire. And of course, we're not going to belabor this point because it really would take us far too far afield. But we appreciate fire eludes our grasp. You cannot grasp fire. The very attempt to do so would, of course, destroy the tools that you have for grasping. Your hands would be incinerated. That Torah of black fire and white fire, of course, likewise, completely eludes our understanding. We cannot grasp it, and if we were to attempt to grasp it, we would incinerate the tool that we have for grasping, not our hands, our minds. So we appreciate that that level of Torah is indeed out of our league. But on some fundamental, essential, even rudimentary level, it's important for us to be cognizant of the fact that the user's manual is a reflection of blueprints, not merely a reflection of a pre-existent car, as it were, but of an underlying divine imperative that the universe itself merely comes to actualize. So that's all, if I may posit it, presumed in the significance of the number 8. And there's one final additional dimension that I feel compelled to note here as a corollary of that verity. And that is an idea that is enunciated in our tradition, the Midrash, on what we read in Lamentations chapter 2, verse 9. The words in the Hebrew, Malkah v'sareh b'goyim ein Torah, bewail the fact that Israel in a state of exile, its king and officers are among nations without Torah. And this verse specifically is taken to highlight a crucial distinction that we need to draw. That is, comments the Midrash, this expression among nations without Torah. If someone says to you, there exists wisdom among the nations, believe it. It does. And the proof text, I can't help but note, but ironically, this proof text in synagogues around the world will be read in the reading from the prophets this coming Shabbat, the prophecy of Obadiah. In the 8th verse of Obadiah, I will cause the wise to be lost from Edom and sagacity from Mount Esau. So if the wise, the Chachamim, are going to be lost from Edom, evidently they were there beforehand. So again, the premise that wisdom exists among the nations, whereas if someone says to you there exists Torah among the nations, don't believe it, citing this verse from Lamentations. Its king and officers are among nations without Torah. Now, of course, predictably, I'm going to state here, obviously, the message of this Midrash pertains precisely to the attempt to conjure up a system of Torah, of spirituality, that is divorced from divine revelation. I keenly appreciate that everyone in this session totally is on the page of recognizing that there is no such thing as a Torah that comes from anywhere other than God. And to that extent, there is no Torah that comes from the nations, that is from humanity qua humanity. There's no humanistic Torah. That is an oxymoron. Torah definitionally is divine. Again, the undergirding of everything that exists in this world. Humanism, to whatever extent it can operates as an overlay on a pre-existent world. Our premise is that Torah is the underlay, the undergirding of the world itself. And to that extent, again, we stress that very realization as we embark upon a discussion of the Torah of God. And as we thus embark upon a discussion of the octuple acrostic of Psalm 119. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. I think this is a good juncture to pause. And if anyone has any comments or questions, then please, by all means, feel free.
Would you mind repeating the name of the rabbi in the 1500s who focused on numbers?
Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague, often known by the acronym Maharal, which stands for our teacher, the Rabbi Lowy. That was the, he was, no. Anyone have any comments?
Yes. I was interested to hear you talk about black fire and white fire, you know, learning from rabbi that I learned from. He would talk about the words, they leap off the page and they speak to you and your heart more than you reading them on the page. That it was like a switch, you know, we think we read them and then we understand them, but indeed they are leaping off the page and coming into our life. And that somewhat reminded me of this black fire on white fire. I'm interested to hear that. I've never heard that that concept before.
So the idea, again, is something that is enunciated in the Midrash, specifically in speaking of Torah as something that, again, in quotes, antedates creation, that, as it were, God gazed in the Torah and created the world. Now, obviously, that doesn't imply that the Torah is some kind of co-creator with God, because God created the Torah as well. But that, on some level, the Torah is the mediation, as it were, between God and the physical universe as we know it. So again, that the Torah is the undergirding. I think the symbolism of fire, besides what we already noted with respect to that which is impalpable, also helps to convey, and maybe this resonates with what you just said, the idea that, you know, we tend to relate to the words as merely means for the ultimate goal, which is our understanding, as opposed to seeing the Word of God as something that is a presence, an actual presence from which, as it were, we imbibe as we would take a sip from an ever-present wellspring that is constantly gushing and providing us with the sustenance. So I think that is relevant here. I realize that talking about wellspring and talking about black fire and white fire is a mixed metaphor, but the idea that there is a presence, an actual presence of Torah with which we connect, as opposed to, well, everything else is just means to our own understanding, and the understanding then is something that exists only in our own minds. No, it's not the understanding exists in our minds. Whatever understanding exists in our minds is through our plugging into this wellspring. So again,
yeah.
the fire we're not going to plug into because we'll get incinerated. but it's important for us to have that conception that there is this counterpart of the user's manual that we read that is indeed transcendent and beyond our grasp. And that again invokes the octuple.
The idea I get from it is that there's this ongoing story. It's alive and it's well, and we get almost like step into the story and become a part of it as it goes along. In that sense, it's quite alive and not something static or, you know, inactive, but quite vibrant in whatever way it is. Well springs, fires, words leaping off the page.
Okay.
It's like happening. So when we open it up, it's almost like an active event that we get to take part in. That's what it
Sure.
seems.
And again, I reiterate my metaphor of plugging in. In other words, that it is a presence. We're connecting with it. We're not the generators. It's not like Torah is in our minds in some sense autonomously from an external reality. No, the external reality is this presence of Torah, which we are imbibing, to
Yeah, I
which
love
we
it.
get plugged in. Okay.
So
So
good. Thank you.
and of course, this theme is manifestly central in Psalm 119, which is all about connecting with God's word, connecting with Torah.
You can hear Rabbi Chaim Eisen live in Texas on February 11th at the Georgetown Public Library. He will be speaking at 7:30 p.m. He will also be speaking in Houston, McKinney, Melissa, and Granbury, Texas in the following days. To get detailed address and times for those other speaking events, just contact Rabbi Eisen directly using WhatsApp with his WhatsApp number listed below. He will be most happy to speak with you and give you those additional details. He would look forward to meeting you, and we hope to see you at one of these new events.